The morning sun streamed through the towering glass windows of a sleek high-rise office building, casting long shadows over the bustling city below. Inside the lavish reception area of Summit Enterprises, the atmosphere buzzed with ambition. Men in tailored suits and women in elegant dresses moved with purpose, clutching their leather portfolios and briefcases. Among them sat Jamal, a soft-spoken 19-year-old with an undeniable fire in his eyes. He wore his one and only suit, a hand-me-down from his uncle that fit him just a little too snug. His polished shoes carried faint scuffs that refused to fade, no matter how much he buffed them the night before. Despite the nerves fluttering in his chest, Jamal sat upright, clutching his resume, a single-page summary of his determination and dreams. Jamal was the eldest of 3 siblings, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts as a nurse to make ends meet. He wasn't just here for himself, he was here for his family. Landing this internship at Summit Enterprises was a chance to change their lives. The pay would help with bills, and the experience could open doors he had only dreamed of. As he waited, the sound of sharp heels clicked across the marble floors. A tall, imposing man with salt and pepper hair emerged from an elevator. This was Richard Sterling, the CEO. His tailored navy blue suit and gold cufflinks screamed success. Richard was known for his ruthless business tactics and an ego that often overshadowed his accomplishments. Richard's gaze swept over the room, and his sharp blue eyes landed on Jamal. He frowned slightly as if the young man's mere presence was an inconvenience. "Mr. Sterling will see you now," the receptionist announced, her voice polite but devoid of warmth. Jamal stood, straightening his tie and clutching his resume tighter. His heart pounded in his chest as he followed Richard into the spacious, intimidating office. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, and the room smelled faintly of leather and expensive cologne. Richard gestured toward a chair without a word, sitting behind his massive mahogany desk. Jamal sat cautiously, placing his resume on the table with trembling hands. "So," Richard began, leaning back in his chair with a dismissive smirk. "You're Jamal Carter." "Yes, sir," Jamal replied, his voice steady despite the knot tightening in his stomach. Richard picked up Jamal's resume and glanced at it for less than 5 seconds before tossing it back onto the desk. "No college degree. No formal experience. And let me guess, you're here because you think hard work and determination are enough to succeed?" Jamal swallowed hard, feeling the sting of Richard's words. "I may not have formal experience, but I've worked part-time jobs since I was 14. I've learned how to problem solve, stay disciplined, and connect with people. I'm confident I can bring value to your company." Richard raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening. "Confidence, huh? Well, that's a start, I suppose. But let me be honest, Jamal, you're not the kind of person we usually consider for a role here. Summit Enterprises thrives on pedigree and excellence, not sob stories about hard work. This isn't a charity." Jamal's cheeks burned, but he refused to let the tears welling in his eyes fall. He needed this chance. But in this moment, as Richard continued to berate him, Jamal felt the weight of every struggle he'd ever faced pressing down on his shoulders. The interview wasn't just a test of his qualifications, it was a test of his spirit. Jamal walked out of Richard Sterling's office with his head low and his heart heavy. The stinging words of the CEO echoed in his mind like a relentless drumbeat. "Not the kind of person we consider." The rejection wasn't just professional, it felt personal. The receptionist avoided Jamal's eyes as he passed her desk, her face a mask of forced neutrality. Other candidates in the waiting area glanced at him with a mix of pity and relief. He didn't belong here, that much was clear to them. The polished floors and pristine glass walls only seemed to reflect his perceived inadequacies. But Jamal wasn't ready to give up. He had promised his mother he'd give this his all. Outside the building, he found a nearby park bench and sat down, pulling out his phone to search for other opportunities. As he scrolled through listings, his mind raced. How could he prove himself in a world that only valued connections and polished resumes? The next week, Jamal showed up at Summit Enterprises again, not as an interviewee, but as a courier delivering packages for a local shipping company. It was a temporary gig, one of the many he juggled to keep his family afloat. His route often took him through the financial district, where he'd catch glimpses of the suited executives rushing to their meetings. One afternoon, he found himself back in the reception area of Summit Enterprises, this time holding a delivery for Richard Sterling himself. The receptionist raised an eyebrow but buzzed him through, gesturing for him to leave the package on Richard's assistant's desk. As Jamal was leaving, he overheard a heated argument coming from Richard's office. He paused, his curiosity piqued. The door was slightly ajar, and he could see Richard berating a junior employee, a woman named Clara. "You think this is acceptable?" Richard thundered, slamming a folder onto the desk. Clara flinched but stood her ground, her voice shaking as she explained the challenges her team had faced. Jamal couldn't help but feel a pang of empathy for Clara. He knew what it was like to be on the receiving end of Richard's scorn. Before he could think twice, he stepped into the office and cleared his throat. Richard turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here? This is a private meeting?" "I'm sorry to interrupt, sir," Jamal said, his voice steady despite the knots in his stomach. "But I couldn't help overhearing. Maybe there's a way to address the problem without tearing someone down?" Richard stared at him, incredulous. "You again? Didn't I make myself clear last week?" Jamal nodded, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You did. But I'm not here for myself. I'm here because I see someone who's working hard and deserves a chance, just like I do." He gestured toward Clara, who looked at him with a mix of surprise and gratitude. Richard's face darkened, but before he could respond, Clara spoke up. "He's right. We've been under pressure, but we're close to a breakthrough. If you give us time." "Enough," Richard interrupted, his voice cold. "Both of you out of my office." Jamal and Clara exchanged a glance before leaving. Outside, Clara turned to him. "That was bold. Thank you." Jamal shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. Sometimes people just need someone to stand up for them. Word of Jamal's intervention spread through the office, earning him the admiration of several employees. Though he wasn't an official member of the team, his presence became a quiet symbol of resilience. Over the next few weeks, Clara and a few others began sharing snippets of their challenges with Jamal whenever he delivered packages. He offered suggestions, drawing from his experience juggling multiple jobs and problem-solving on the fly. Meanwhile, Richard began to notice the shift in his team's dynamic. Productivity improved and morale was higher than it had been in months. One day during a routine meeting, Clara mentioned Jamal's contributions. "Wait," Richard said, raising a hand. "You're telling me the courier has been giving you advice?" Clara hesitated but nodded. "He has a way of seeing things from a different perspective. It's been helpful." Richard's jaw tightened. He hated being wrong, especially about people. But he couldn't ignore the results. Reluctantly, he decided to observe Jamal more closely. The real turning point came during an office crisis. A last-minute presentation for an important client was in jeopardy due to a technical glitch. The team scrambled to fix the issue, but time was running out. Jamal, who had been delivering a package, overheard the commotion and stepped in. "Let me take a look," he offered. The team hesitated, but with no better option, they handed him the laptop. Within minutes, Jamal had identified the problem and found a workaround. The presentation was saved, and the client left impressed. Richard watched the scene unfold from his office, a grudging respect forming in his mind. Jamal wasn't just lucky, he was resourceful, quick-thinking, and unshakable under pressure. Later that day, Richard called Jamal into his office. The young man entered cautiously, unsure of what to expect. "You seem to have a habit of being in the right place at the right time," Richard began, his tone unreadable. "I just try to help where I can," Jamal replied. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying him. "Tell me, Jamal, if I offered you another interview, under different circumstances, would you take it?" Jamal's eyes widened in surprise, but he quickly nodded. "Yes, sir. I would." "Good," Richard said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Be here tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Don't make me regret this." As Jamal left the office, a renewed sense of hope filled his chest. This wasn't just a second chance, it was an opportunity to prove that resilience and determination could triumph over prejudice and doubt. The following morning, Jamal arrived at Summit Enterprises, dressed sharply in a second-hand suit he had carefully pressed the night before. He took a deep breath before stepping into the lobby, determined to make the most of his second chance. Richard Sterling, already in the conference room with several senior executives, glanced at his watch as Jamal entered. Without a word, Richard motioned for Jamal to take a seat at the far end of the table. "This is a working session," Richard began curtly. "We've just signed a major contract, and we need innovative strategies to execute it effectively. Let's see what you've got." Jamal realized this wasn't a typical interview, it was a test. One by one, the executives presented their plans. They spoke in jargon-filled monologues, outlining ideas that felt polished but uninspired. Jamal listened intently, taking notes, his mind racing with ways to contribute. When it was his turn, Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "All right, Jamal. Let's hear your brilliant insights." Jamal stood, his heart pounding. Thank you for this opportunity. I may not have the same experience as everyone here, but I believe I can offer a fresh perspective. Using a marker, Jamal sketched a diagram on the whiteboard, breaking down his proposal. His plan focused on leveraging underutilized resources within the company while collaborating with local communities to build brand loyalty. He highlighted specific cost-saving measures and practical implementation steps. The room was silent when he finished. Then one of the executives spoke up. That's actually quite clever. I hadn't considered the community angle before. Another nodded. It's bold, but it could work. Richard's face remained impassive, but Jamal noticed a flicker of something in his eyes. Respect, perhaps? This plan has potential, Richard finally said. But potential isn't enough. Let's see if you can handle real pressure. He handed Jamal a thick file. This is a time-sensitive project. Review it, identify the flaws, and report back to me by the end of the day. Jamal nodded, determined not to falter. He spent the next several hours poring over the file, cross-referencing data, and compiling his findings. As the day wore on, some employees stopped by to offer encouragement, their earlier admiration for Jamal now growing into genuine support. By late afternoon, Jamal returned to Richard's office with his report. Richard skimmed through it, his expression unreadable. Finally he looked up. This is impressive, Richard admitted, his tone begrudging. You've not only identified the weak points but also proposed actionable solutions. I didn't expect that. Jamal smiled, his confidence growing. Thank you, sir. I just focused on the areas I knew I could improve. Richard leaned back in his chair, his steely exterior softening. You've proven you're more than capable, Jamal. I was wrong about you, and for that I apologize. Jamal was stunned. Hearing an apology from someone like Richard was more than he had expected. Let me make this right, Richard continued. I'm offering you a position here, full-time. You've earned it. Emotion welled up in Jamal's chest, but he kept his composure. Thank you, Mr. Sterling. I won't let you down. As Jamal left the office that evening, he felt a wave of pride and relief. His perseverance had paid off, and he had not only secured a job but also earned the respect of someone who had once doubted him. A month later, Summit Enterprises held a company-wide event to announce a series of new initiatives aimed at community engagement and diversity in hiring. Jamal stood beside Richard Sterling at the podium as Richard introduced him as the new head of community outreach and innovation, a role specifically created to implement the ideas Jamal had proposed during his interview. The announcement was met with applause, and Jamal felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The very company where he had once been dismissed had now become a platform for his ideas and vision. Behind the scenes, Richard had undergone a quiet transformation. He began to reflect on the biases that had shaped his initial judgment of Jamal. In a candid moment during the event, Richard pulled Jamal aside and said, "You didn't just prove me wrong. You reminded me of what leadership should really be about, listening, learning, and uplifting others. Thank you for that." Jamal smiled. "And thank you for giving me the chance to show you." Meanwhile, Jamal's story began to spread within the company and beyond. Employees who had once been skeptical now looked up to him as a symbol of perseverance and innovation. His rise inspired others to speak up and share their own ideas, creating a more inclusive and dynamic workplace culture. But the impact didn't stop there. Jamal took it upon himself to mentor young people in the community, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds. He partnered with local schools to offer workshops on professional skills and leadership, ensuring that others wouldn't have to face the same struggles he had endured. As for Richard, his journey of growth didn't go unnoticed. The board of directors commended his willingness to embrace change, and his reputation as a leader evolved. He became an advocate for equitable hiring practices, making sure that the company he led reflected the diversity of the world it served. One evening, as Jamal walked home from the office, he passed by the diner where he had worked countless shifts just to make ends meet. He paused for a moment, gazing at the neon sign flickering in the window. It felt like a lifetime ago. A familiar voice called out, "Jamal?" It was Mrs. Carter, the diner's owner, who had always been a source of encouragement. "Look at you now," she said, beaming with pride. "I knew you were destined for greatness." Jamal chuckled. "Thanks, Mrs. Carter. I couldn't have done it without people like you believing in me." As he walked away, the weight of his journey settled over him, not as a burden, but as a reminder of how far he had come and the responsibility he now carried. The moral of Jamal's story resonated with everyone who heard it. Never underestimate someone based on appearances and never give up on yourself, even when the odds seem insurmountable. In the face of adversity, strength, humility, and perseverance can lead to a brighter future. Not just for yourself but for everyone you touch along the way. Jamal's story is a powerful reminder that our worth cannot be determined by outward appearances or initial judgments. It highlights the importance of resilience and self-belief in overcoming prejudice and adversity. His journey demonstrates that no obstacle is insurmountable when we remain steadfast in our values and true to our vision. At the same time, Richard's transformation speaks to the capacity for growth and change in all of us. By acknowledging his own biases and embracing a more inclusive perspective, he not only redeemed himself but also inspired a ripple effect of positive change within his company and community. This story challenges us to reflect on our own actions and attitudes. Are we quick to judge others without truly seeing their potential? Do we create opportunities for those who may not fit the mold, but whose talent and determination could surprise us? Ultimately, the lesson is clear. When we choose compassion over judgment, openness over bias, and perseverance over despair, we create a world where everyone has a chance to shine. Let this be an inspiration to lead with kindness, believe in the power of change, and never underestimate the impact of one person's courage to make a difference.